Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining today's webinar presentation, Using Patent Analytics to Identify Innovation Growth Areas. I'm Allie Morton, the head of field marketing here at LexisNexis IP, and we have a really exciting and informative webinar for you today. Before we get started, I'd like to just cover a few housekeeping things. In the control panel, you will see a handout section. This is where you can access the webinar slides for today's presentation, along with a handout on our patent site product. During the webinar, please feel free to submit questions using the questions feature in the control panel. And a follow-up email of the recording from today's presentation along with the slides will be sent out to you by tomorrow. Now I would like to introduce our presenters. With us today, we have Kolin Schunck, a passionate future of mobility analyst with an extensive background of educational and hands-on experience in the academia, tech industry, and digital innovation startup ecosystem. He is extremely skilled in data collection, analysis, synthesis, and turning data into compelling visualizations and business implications. He currently works at Lufthansa Innovation Hub. Also joining us today is Karsten Guderian, Senior Project Leader at LexisNexis, previously a lecturer at FAU and graduated in Business Administration and Economics from Christian Albrechts University. He was a researcher at WHU and is a visiting research fellow at the Kellogg School of Management of Northwestern University. His research focuses on patent analytics, patent valuation, and investment decisions. And last, but certainly not least, we have Jean Quinn, the founder of IP Watchdog, a patent attorney, law professor, and leading commentator on patent law and innovation policy. Jean has been named one of the world's leading IP strategists by IAM Magazine multiple times. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Jean. Oh, Jean, we can't hear you.
I put myself on mute as you suggested. And, you know, when you suggested it, I thought to myself, you know, there's a risk that I will forget to unmute myself, but now I won't do that. Sorry about that, everyone. But thank you for the introduction, Allie, and thank you all for joining us here today. We really appreciate you joining us, and thank you to the panelists for joining us and putting together a very interesting program here for us today. What we're going to do is we're going to look at some interesting research into a specific area dealing with air taxis, but we're using that as a vehicle in order to show what you can really learn from looking really at patent data to see. Sometimes there can be great insights that can be gathered from looking at the data in order to gain market intelligence and gain intelligence about specific companies. And there will be some very interesting insights into this particular industry, which is in and of itself a very exciting and up and coming industry. And for those of us who are at least of my age, you know, growing up, we kind of grew up with the cartoons like, you know, the Jetsons and where things were flying around in the sky and everything. So it's interesting to see that we may be starting to live in that kind of an age. So thank you both for joining us. And what I'd like to do is before I turn it over to you, Kolin, to walk us through the slides, I'd like to get both of your initial thoughts on this topic and what you'd like the attendees to be thinking about. Let's start with you, Kolin. When we're thinking about patent analytics, or we're thinking specifically about air taxis, or whatever it is that you would like the audience to focus on initially, what are your preliminary thoughts here today?
Yeah, so today my thoughts would be that opinion-based decision-making is good, but not sufficient, and data-driven based decision-making is even better. And that's what we at the Lufthansa Innovation Hub are actually doing. All our decisions are based on data-driven facts, our analysis, and that's what we also discovered and did with the air taxi studies that I'm going to deep dive in a minute. And the second thought is that looking only at one data point or one data perspective is usually not enough, but actually to consider multiple data views and combine them to actually come up with meaningful insights.
Mhm. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Colin. Carson, your preliminary thoughts here before we kick off with the substance of the slides.
Sure. Hi. So welcome from my end as well. I actually have to follow Colin's footsteps there in saying that I think that patents just serve as a great data source, as a comprehensive data source to identify many things that exist, so or that are coming, because it's really forward-oriented. There are great opportunities that exist with patent data as a data source, and I'm very glad that we can take a look into this today. So often I do see decision makers actually when I work with them on a day-to-day basis, many decisions are based on gut feelings or because they believe that there is no data on certain aspects, and I guess that patents serve as a great tool. So looking forward to discuss this today.
Great. Well, thank you both very much. My preliminary thought is that you never know what the data shows until you actually look. And sometimes the data is not going to show anything that's going to be actionable, but that in and of itself is useful data. It's sort of like the Thomas Edison view of experimentation. You didn't have 2,000 failed experiments. What you did is you found 2,000 things that won't work. So that's useful information. But a lot of times when you look, the data tells you a story. Sometimes that story confirms what you believed, and sometimes that story opens your eyes to new possibilities. But you don't know if you don't look. And now we have tools that allow you to really take a insightful look, and that's what we're going to do today in this example. What I want to tell everybody is Colin unfortunately has a flight that he has to get to, so he's going to probably need to bug out here a bit early. So we're going to start with him. And Colin, I'll let you just take it away so we can get as much of your time as we have available.
Sure. Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation to present results of our air taxi study. And I also welcome everybody who dialed in so far. And also happy to answer questions while I'm going through my slides. So the overall topic, as already outlined, is today is focusing on the urban air mobility space, or how we termed it or call it, the air taxi space. A lot of things happened in the past and also recently in this area, especially since roughly beginning of 2020s, where we saw that the overall space really kicked up in speed in terms of VC fundings, that startups were able to close, partnerships are being formed, and also interestingly, the patent issue came into our focus with, for example, the startup Archer Aviation being sued by Wisk Aero of patent infringement. So there is a lot of dynamic in the space that happened to kick in recently, and we from the Lufthansa Innovation Hub took a closer look into this area, as it obviously plays into the overall aviation space as well. And if we look at the overall air taxi market, we see that this space is consists of multiple players from various industries. We see the usual aerospace companies like Airbus and also Boeing, Embraer, Bell Helicopter. We also see automotive players moving into this area more recently now. For example, XPeng, the Chinese automotive maker, recently released their flying car concept. Daimler is invested into an air taxi startup, as well as Geely. Porsche is exploring the space. So there's a lot of stuff going on from various players. And we also see the more obvious players that are kind of almost active in any industry these days, which are technology companies. And then we have also lots of startups there that are working on various projects. Currently, we can count 170 plus projects out there that are being followed by startups, but only in a few actually, at least that's our point of view, can be considered as very promising, and that they actually in the end make it into the market. And if you look at this overall market map here, you can see, okay, we have very little airlines in this area. We have Japan Airlines who are active or who are working together with Volocopter, JetBlue with Joby Aviation, United Airlines investing into Archer Aviation, but that's kind of it. And we at Lufthansa Innovation Hub, with this study, try to get a better picture of this overall space, what's happening, what does it mean for the aviation industry, and also what's in it for Lufthansa in the end. So before I actually jump into some of our results, I quickly obviously would like to introduce to you the Lufthansa Innovation Hub. What are we actually doing and what areas are we actually covering? So the Lufthansa Innovation Hub is the main digital innovation unit of the Lufthansa Group. We are based in the capital city of Berlin with satellite offices in Singapore and also soon to be in Shanghai. As from our point of view, the Asian market is where innovation is really accelerating and where the technology, the disruptive technology, is being developed of the future. And we connect our parent company, the Lufthansa Group, with the so-called travel and mobility tech ecosystem, meaning that we are actually the connection between the corporate mother and the mobility startups out there. We do not only look at aviation-related startups. We actually cover the overall travel ecosystem, meaning we look at accommodation like hotels. We look at car sharing. We look at e-scooters, so micromobility. We look at aviation, obviously, so urban air mobility, what we are talking about today, and also inspiration. So we actually cover the overall travel chain, so to speak. Our mission of the Lufthansa Innovation Hub is to create and capture value beyond flying. And by doing this, we have different teams or capabilities, how we call them, in place. One is called Discover, which is where I work in. That's the data-driven research and market intelligence function. We look out for upcoming trends or detect trends and then channel them into the Lufthansa Innovation Hub to the other teams, such as the partner, build teams, invest teams, so that they actually can come up with new business ideas and turn those ideas into a new venture, for example, or engage in a partnership, or even invest into a startup, for example. Okay, so with this, I would like to introduce you to the overall air taxi study that we did back in February this year. So we published it in February 2021. And we looked at 4 main areas. One was sentiment. So we looked into how is this overall urban air mobility space perceived by people, by the press, for example. Has it negative or positive sentiment? Then we looked into the overall venture capital investment area. How many funds actually or money flowed into or has flown into the space, which are the most promising startups out there in terms of received funding. We also looked into the overall research or academic research area. So what are the most research intensive institutions out there that are looking into urban air mobility? And then we also took a deeper look into the patent or technology area. And today I'm going to focus solely on the technology area here primarily. I will also quickly introduce you with 2 slides of the venture capital landscape, because that's also important, and there's also a connection later on in the patent analysis where we actually combine different data views. So to start, when we look at the urban air mobility space, then we can at least say that the amount of money that a startup possesses and collects from investors is crucial to be successful, because such a startup needs to develop those air taxis, they need to certify them, produce, like manufacture, and so on and so on. So these startups, they need massive amounts of funding actually and partners to be successful. And what we saw since actually last year, beginning of last year, that funding into the space has exploded. So and even 2021 is way above the figures of 2020 already. So we have a growth of funding of more than 400% compared to 2020, just until June 2021. And we already have 5 unicorns in the space. Unicorns are defined as a startup who's valued more than $1 billion US. And this most likely will also grow in the coming months. And if we now look at the different startups that are out there and who is actually the most well-funded air taxi startup, we see Joby Aviation, who is US-based in California, who so far collected most of the funding. We have Lilium, a German-based company, Archer Aviation, in US-based, Vertical, Beta, Volocopter, who can be considered the core of most promising startups. We then need to consider that a startup in this space need at least $1 billion in capital to actually go through development and certification. There are also experts out there who say even that number is not enough. They probably need 1.7 billion, but so at least 1 billion is needed. And if you look at the current funding figures, we see, okay, we have 3 players out there who are past the minimum threshold, namely Joby, Lilium, and Archer. Potentially the other Vertical, Beta, and Volocopter, for example, aim for going public through a SPAC, so special purpose acquisition company, such as Volocopter. So they might be raising more money in the coming months as well. What's interesting, if you look now at the valuation, for example, Joby Aviation is valued, at least with end of March this year, at 6.6 billion. If you look at, I think, at the current Lufthansa stock price, Lufthansa is valued at a similar amount or even less than that. So Joby Aviation never sold an aircraft yet or an air taxi, but is valued more than overall Lufthansa with all their fleet. So there is a big shift happening, and we as the Lufthansa Innovation Hub takes this very seriously to come up with answers of what this means for aviation and especially for Lufthansa in general. So, but now actually entering the technology or patent analysis that we conducted, and I'd like to give you a quick background here. So we looked at, as I outlined before, at different data views, so sentiment analysis, venture capital, research, and so on. And we figured that no one so far has looked at the patent landscape in this area. At least not to our knowledge, it wasn't published. So we took the patent site tool here, made it to use, and gained very interesting insights, and especially if combined with other data points, such as venture capital data. And that's why I, at the beginning, said that combining different data points or perspectives provides you with real benefit and value actually to assess, for example, a startup, to assess a given space. And when we look at the patent filings here, we saw in general first that there is a steady increase, a steady growth, especially since 2015. And when you deep dive into the different areas or timeframes, for example, we were able to see that, for example, the corporates were actually like Boeing and so on, Airbus, Rolls-Royce, even Toyota, were the first movers who were filing patents in this domain, in this urban air mobility domain. And these patents mainly protected like an air taxi design, for example, navigational aspects surrounding the VTOL aircraft, and so on. Then the next time period was where actually the first startups emerged. And the main players out there that filed during that time patents were Kitty Hawk, Aeromobile, Volocopter, and also Joby Aviation. And Joby Aviation also has quite a valuable patent protecting first one of their aircraft designs, but also a noise mitigation technology. And the latter will be and is critical for public acceptance in this overall space. And then when we look from 2015 onwards, we see that, or when we look into the data, then we see that startups actually take over the overall space. So startups are the major driver here in patent filings in the urban air mobility space. And the major players that filed patents starting in 2015 onwards were EHang, which is an air taxi player based in China, and Kitty Hawk, showing the greatest growth rate of those patent filings. If we look now on the corporate side, so what happened to the corporates in this between 2015 to 2020, we can see that, for example, Boeing was able to keep its position in terms of patent filings or as a patent filer. But Boeing, it wasn't Boeing in itself, it was actually the company, or I'm going to call it startup, Wisk Aero, who was the actual patent filer in this case, because Wisk Aero is a joint venture between Boeing and Kitty Hawk. And when we further divide those two types, startups and corporates, and we see that the startups actually have an impressive, strong technology base, and we took this by looking at the patent asset index here. So we have on the left-hand side the patent count, and on the right-hand side the patent asset index, and we see, for example, that overall, the corporates account for 66% of the patent count, startups 34%, but on the contrary, the startups actually secure more patent strengths compared to corporates, meaning they file more qualitative patents in this area. And that is unusual if you compare this with other industries, for example. So now we looked at
so
more
Colin,
specific companies.
Can I interrupt you
Yeah.
for a sec? We have a question
Sure.
regarding how do you define patents related to air taxis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a good question. So we actually did a deep dive search using different or certain IPC classes, and also by keyword searches. That was one step, and the second step was that we included all the players that we already know or knew during the time that were solely active in this urban air mobility space. So, for example, Joby Aviation. So they are only active in this area. So patents that Joby Aviation, for example, filed are all related to the air taxi space. In the contrary, if you look at Airbus, for example, you wouldn't be able to take the overall Airbus patent portfolio because obviously there is a lot of other stuff in there that's being protected, and that we try to figure out with specific keyword searches.
Okay, great.
Okay, and so what we see here on the slide is in green highlighted are all the startups, and the gray ones are corporate companies. And on the left-hand side, again, we have it's ranked by patent count, so by portfolio size, and then on the right-hand side, it's by patent asset index, so the overall patent strength or power a player exploits with its portfolio. And what we see here is that, for example, in general, startups are ranked at the top, with EHang having the biggest portfolio so far, but they're losing in terms of patent strength. So they create a lot of patents, but these ones are not as relevant as, for example, the patents that Whisk Aero is actually producing. And then if you look at Lilium, for example, because that's also an interesting case, Lilium has, at least so far, only 4 patents filed, which are published or publicly available, with a rather low patent asset index overall. And this could also be a strategic move by Lilium. So I would like to avoid to say that this is a bad or that this is bad in general, but it could also be a tactical or strategic move by Lilium. I don't know, for example, to keep the know-how in-house, protect them as a trade secret or whatever, because obviously I believe that they do have a lot of IP in-house, but maybe they haven't filed it yet. Yeah, and then if we now combine from the patent data 2 variables, one portfolio size, so the overall amount of patents held by a respective player, and look at the average technology relevance. And the average technology relevance is a metric offered by the patent site software tool based on forward citations. And we use this to get a better understanding who possesses relevant technology and who actually has a large portfolio with highly relevant disruptive technologies. And by doing this, we can see, for example, EHang on the lower right-hand side has the biggest portfolio, but the relevance of the respective patents or inventions they protect is rather low. It's below the average. So 0.5 is like the average here, and it's below the average.
So can you,
and then if you look at,
we have a question about, can you tell us how the relevance is determined?
The technology relevance.
Yeah.
Maybe Carsten, because Carsten can jump in and explain it, because it's
sure, I can do so,
I guess.
So technology relevance is our metric, which we base on forward citations. But when PatentSite was founded, our founders actually identified, and in looking into prior research on the field of how to link patent indicators to patent values, that the number of forward citations is a commonly used indicator, but there are some impediments to the usability of forward citations as an indicator to the relevance. So for example, the citations patents receive are dependent on the age of the patents and different citation propensities in different technology fields and amongst different patent offices. So we correct for these aspects, and thus it's a measure of the forward citations on a family-to-family level, but correct for these aspects. And that allows us to identify how often a certain patent and its underlying technologies are actually subsequently used by other technologies, or which other technologies based on it. So the rationale there is, the more often they are used and cited or referred to, the more relevant it is.
Yeah. Okay. And, forward citations, I know a lot of people say, oh, well, that's not, that's flawed. That's not, but every study that looks into it finds repeatedly that is the best way in order to determine, relevance. So, it is the old standby, it's the new standby, it's tried and true. Then we also have a question about patent asset index. How is that determined? And we did an entire webinar on that and really only scratched the surface. What I'll do is I'll just very quickly say that this patent asset index it's an open source calculation. If you really want to know, there's white paper on it that goes into a lot of detail how it is calculated, and it's been relied upon by the European Commission in order to determine when companies are merging, whether they're merging and combining too much technology. So it's been found to be relevant enough and reliable enough by European antitrust regulators. So it's totally open if you want to learn about it, but it would take hours to describe it, and we did just a surface review of it in an entire webinar. So we can get you that information after the fact. Anybody that is interested, please reach out, and Patent Site's happy to get you that information so you can feel comfortable with the metric. Back to you, Colin.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. So if you continue looking at the slide, we can see that there's only one company located at the upper right hand side, which is Viskero here in this case, as they offer a large patent portfolio in combination with a high technology relevance score, and that's why we position this company or the startup in this case as the technology leader, at least for the moment. And that's also important to consider. This will change over time. When we looked at this area, the space back in January or February, we actually had a different positioning of these companies and startups. And this will change once more patents are being published and so on. So this slide is as of now, as of July 2021. But just keep in mind that it will change as obviously the situation and patent landscape changes. And you might ask now yourself, okay, why isn't Archer on here? Why isn't Vertical Aerospace on here? Because I talked about them in the venture capital section. And that's because there are no at least published patents there yet. And that's why we weren't able to include them in this analysis, obviously. So now would like to show you another metrics where we combined the different data views. So we used patent data and also venture capital data and applied it to only startups in this space here, on this slide. And we have on the x-axis VC funding raised, so the amount a player has raised so far, and on the y-axis the average competitive impact, which is another metric of the patent site software. So the patent site software provides different metrics here, and the competitive impact can be regarded as a quality indicator. And when we look at this, or when we looked at this, we obviously see that Joby Aviation and is positioned at the right-hand side, way up there, because they first received a lot of funding. They are the most funded player out there from a startup perspective, but the average competitive impact is very strong. And if we look, for example, at Lilium on the other hand also raised a lot of money, but they lack the let's say qualitative substance of their patent applications. And when you look into Lilium patents here, then you will see that, for example, they so far, at least what's published, only protect one country, and that's Germany. They leave out many other countries like US and so on, and this will or this has an effect on the competitive impact here in this case. Then we also see, when we look at the left-hand side, Volocopter and Kitty Hawk, which we term the great innovators. So they could be like so-called gems because they have a quite relevant or high competitive impact in this game, but they still lack some or substantial VC funding yet. So in case Volocopter is going to close another deal this year, they might move further to the right-hand side and make Volocopter on par with Jobby and Whisk Arrow. I included Whisk Arrow here just to let's show, or just to show where this company would be positioned. Obviously, Whisk Arrow did not receive any official VC funding because they belong to Boeing and Kitty Hawk. And so this analysis that we did or study on the air taxi space provided us with more clarity of the overall space. We got a better understanding of the startups, of the corporates that are active out there. We were able to understand where research is actually happening, in which countries, for example. We were able to sense public sentiment. So how is the news reporting about this air taxi space in the various geographies? And all this provided us with a very clear and better picture of this overall space. And we use this analysis to further work on this topic and provide valuable information for the Lufthansa Group on how to proceed in the air taxi space. And that's also, again, what I wanted to say at the beginning. It's important not only to look at one data perspectives like venture capital, but it's important to actually look at various data streams out there, including pattern analytics, which can provide very valuable insights of a player, and combine it and then come up with a good and solid recommendation and implications for the top management. And just as a funny side note, I screened the patent data back in March, I think, again, and I found within Volocopter, I found a new patent that was published at the end of 2020. I think it was 31st of December. And I saw a picture of the Volo Connect. So the Volo Connect is a longer range aircraft that Volocopter is developing. And at this time, it wasn't public. So I saw it in the patent data, and this provided me with valuable insights as I were able to see what Volocopter is actually working on, what maybe even strategies they pursue. And I could already sense and communicate within Lufthansa that Volocopter might not only focus on airport to city or very short haul routes, but that they're also will most likely focus on medium haul routes. And that obviously provided us with very valuable insights here. So, and this actually brings me to the end of my my presentation, and I have a short conclusion here. So when we look back in history, this is Fifth Avenue, 1900, and the question is, can you spot the car? Lots of horses out there. Maybe you can spot one or two cars there. 10 years later or 13 years later, there is barely a horse out there. Mainly cars are being used. And the same maybe will happen with air taxis. So there's a lot of doubt out there yet. Lots of naysayers saying, it's never going to happen. But I would not underestimate what's possible, and actually hope that this space will take off in the future, and that we as a Lufthansa will also play a part in it. And with this, I'm going to close my presentation by providing you with some links where you can actually access our study for free. So one is the air taxi study. It's called Air Taxis Ready for Prime Time. The other is the so-called advanced air mobility ecosystem study we did recently. And obviously we have a newsletter which you can also sign up for, and then you receive a bi-weekly newsletter with all the insights directly to your inbox.
Great.
And
Well,
with
thank
this,
you.
I'm gonna
Yeah.
hand over to Carsten, or happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Colin. We really, really appreciate it. There's a few people that are, oh, yeah, no, I'm not muted. I just wanted to check. Sorry about that. There's a few people that are asking questions about how it is that Lilium has a low patent index, but had a high technology relevance. And I think I get it, but I'm a bit more familiar with the tool. And then there was, well, how were they able to raise money if that was the case? Which that's a different business question. But can one of you, and this maybe is Carson, maybe it's better for you, but Colin, if you have some thoughts, how is it possible that they have a higher technology relevance but a lower patent score?
Yeah, so just I'm gonna answer the second question first. Raising venture capital is not always based on the patent portfolio a company or startup possesses. There are several other factors that come into play, like the team is very important. That's a decisive factor here. And so patents in general are at some point important, but it's not always the decisive or the go and break point here if a startup raises money or not. The first question, I just want to make a comment and then hand over to Carsten, is because the competitive impact consists of technology relevance and market coverage. And Lilium, as I said before, only protected its technology in Germany, and that results in a lower overall competitive impact score. Nonetheless, their technology could potentially be or has a high relevance, at least in this area. And Carsten, feel free to add.
You basically sort of well explained it. The thing is that, as we for the competitive impact, we actually include, as Colin just mentioned, the size of the market where technologies are protected and the impact it has. So how often it is cited correct for these aspects we talked about earlier. So we do argue that the competitive impact or the average quality, as we would determine then, is actually lower for patents that cannot be enforced in large geographical space. So that's exactly what happened here. So I think you can well answer that. Thank you.
Yeah. And before I give my thoughts, I'm looking at the clock, and Colin, I know you need to get out of here. So what I'd like to ask you is, do you have any final thoughts for the audience, and then we can relieve you of your duties so you can head to the airport?
Yeah, so my final thoughts would be actually what you said at the beginning of this webinar, that if you look into patent data, you can spot, you can discover insights that are not known to anyone else out there. And if you then combine it with other data views like venture capital analysis or academic research data, you really get a bigger picture and better understand the overall space. And that helps at least us as a company to move forward in this overall space and know which players to approach, which areas to focus on. And yeah, so it's not only important to look at one data perspective, but actually combine it with multiple ones.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Colin. We really appreciate your time, and have a safe flight. And we look forward to maybe having you back in the future. And we'll make sure that everybody gets access to the Lufthansa report there. And so, Carson, for the next 15 minutes, it's you and I, and we can talk a little bit. What I'd like to go back to is the question about why the venture capital funding. I think patents are essential for a lot of companies when you're raising venture capital. But essentially, when people are giving you money, they're trying to decide, are you going to be successful? That's the ultimate question. And so much a part of that question is, who are you? You know, I mean, you could have the greatest patent portfolio in the world, and your team could just be made up of a bunch of crazy inventors who've never run a business, and you're going to have a real hard time finding anybody that wants to give you money. You know, so patents, I think, are a key piece in the puzzle, and they have to be in place. And venture capitalists are usually not patent people, they're business people, and they're very smart business people, and they're very good at allocating risk. So they decide, well, I can take a risk on this company. So the people in place are so critically important, just like Kolin said. So when you're trying to raise venture capital, it's not like they have a form and they're literally checking boxes. So don't take this literally, but you need to check the boxes. Do you have patents? Yes, check. Do you have a good management team? Yes, check. Do you have a business plan that makes sense, that suggests that you have thought through this? Check. Yes. Have you thought through the competitive marketplace and landscape? Check. Yes. I mean, so that's what they're looking for. Carson, any thoughts on that?
I completely agree. I mean, if you look into these shows that we have on TV, right? I think it's called Dragon's Den or something in the US. That's there's a German equivalent of this. The patents or the IP is always part of the questions, and we do see increasingly that companies are provided with funding based on the IP. We do see that IP and patents are used as collateral. We do see a lot of these things happening. So particularly venture capital access or access to finance for startups, for smaller companies, is often nowadays decided by patents. We do see a lot of this, and I guess there's more to come. Using various data sources, combining patents, as mentioned a couple of times today, with other sources, just provides a lot of great insights. I've just recently been involved in a collaboration with some guys from Switzerland, and we looked into the finance industry, and we actually looked into which other data sources could be used. And you know, in absence of, for example, sales data, if they are not supposed or if they do not need to be published, what people are nowadays using are crazy things such as, you know, pictures from parking lots, for example, to actually estimate how used a certain, you know, company or a certain factory or a certain outlet or whatsoever is, in terms of, you know, identifying or somehow indirectly measuring the potential sales that could come from it. So various data sources, direct, indirect measures that can be used there, and so that's something that we do see.
Well, and even just in the Collins analysis, when he showed that chart where you have Velocopter, I think that was the name of the company, right? And they've got a reasonably high or too high patent score, and they've raised very little money compared to Joby.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, so there's a company that you look at that could very well be poised to explode with, you know, so so that's the type of insight that you look at this and you're like, huh, you know, you wouldn't necessarily have known that if you hadn't done the analysis. And whenever we do these, something like that always jumps out. And I always think that, you know, if you are interested in deal making or even investing in the stock market, this kind of data is just very, very useful. And I always go back to the example where we had identified Moderna 6 weeks before they became a household name based on vaccines as having a unusually high patent asset score for their vaccines. And then 6 weeks later, all of a sudden, they're the darlings of the world, you know? And so you never know what you're going to find when you look.
But
right?
and that is also that most of the times you are not going to find something surprising. We've mentioned this also, and non-information or a non-hit is also valuable information in essence. So most of the times as we do analysis, we do not come across something that's special. We do not come across something that stands out. And so I've actually pulled together a set of recommendations. I hope that, you know, it jumps over to the specific slide. I hope, can you see it, or has it not been?
Yep, it's,
You just
yep,
jump over quickly to
it's
that
going
slide.
to,
But I've collected a set of things that we could be incorporating in future analytics, or in what we need to do to actually enable us to derive results that actually do provide some kind of sense. And so this is a list of 8 items or 8 things that I would consider as I do this. So the first thing is we need to know, as Colin also mentioned, who owns what. We have seen that there are joint ventures. We do see that, of course, patents are filed under various different names, and so we do need to understand who owns which patents to then be able to really identify, what an interface looks like, and who might be new players that pop in, or how some established players might have, additionally pulled in something, or are doing some activity in a certain area. Included with this is that patents as well as IP often pertain to different lifetimes, or at least to limited lifetimes. So also this is information that is valuable. We often do see results, or we often do see studies where individuals do not consider the legal status. So they basically build their ideas on something that might have ceased to exist, that is no longer enforceable, and of course that impedes the usability. Then, as also mentioned, and we've seen this in Colin's study earlier today, it does make sense to look into longitudinal data, so not just anything cross-sectional. So, just going to the doctor and figuring out that you are okay today does not necessarily mean that you are okay in 6 months or a year. Now, I hope that that's not going to happen, that everyone will stay fine. But what I'm trying to say here is that, of course, we need to check out how things develop. Look into change rates. Look into some players that might pop up over a certain time. And most often, the striking changes are not in the top 3 or the top 5, but actually as you go down the list. If you do analytics, and if you figure out a company that jumps from position, I don't know, 100 in a certain space to position 20 or 30. Something that is comparable is, for example, if you were into sports and you watch like tennis or something, it's identifying those players that might pop up as the next superstars. Yeah, we know the top 10 or the top 15, but there might be a younger player who's just started to move up the ranks from being ranked 200th in the world up to rank 30, and this might be someone to watch out for. Of course, the same happens with companies right there. Next thing that really also pertaining to data is that we might want to combine different sources. Now, we've mentioned VC today, so venture capital. We've mentioned financial data. We've mentioned other data sources. That does make a lot of sense. I'm also calling here to actually look into different IP rights if possible. So combinations, integrated strategies, combining, for example, patent, trademark, and/or copyright protection. Trade secrets is something that, of course, often shows up. So whenever possible, try to include this. Now, of course, there are some sources where this is possible. Trade secrets might be something too hard to grasp, but people have tried this, and so that does make a lot of sense. So various data aspects listed to the left right here. And then in terms of the patent metrics that we use, I do have a couple of suggestions on this as well. One is, we have seen this today, and we've just had questions on this. So looking into quantity-driven indicators only does not make a lot of sense. So you might want to consider quality differences. You might want to look into different indicators and figure out if they point in the same direction. So just saying, there's a company that has suddenly filed a lot does not necessarily mean that they are going to be important. So you might want to figure out more information on these specific companies. Then something that I find super interesting, and that is increasing also if you look into the academic research and the recent academic research, is that people are trying to identify so-called indicator combinations. So that if 1 or 2 or even more things change at the same time, or even subsequently to each other, that this might tell us something about how it moves. So various options there. And then I'll be done.
Can I stop you there? Because, that's really interesting, because, from an investment standpoint, that's always been a way that, like visual investors or visual investing, it's called, you're looking, and it's kind of a misnomer because it's all based on data. It's visual because they put it into charts or graphs, and when you see like certain lines crossing each other, that's at the moment in time when it's like, okay, this is it's a moment where maybe it's a buying opportunity, or it's a sell now opportunity, and it kind of foreshadows what's about to happen. Either the stock is going to be going up or the stock is going to be going down. So I'm really interested in these combination indicators. Are you finding any of those, or is that something that people are looking for, or is it kind of industry dependent?
It's a combination of all of those, I would say. So when we do see with the patent asset index and its constituent indicators, for example, that combining a variant of the citation-based metric with the market size is something that does make sense because it provides additional insights that are not attainable with the quantity-based metrics. But we do see that there's definitely need for additional ones in this regard. So additional indicators that might incorporate different aspects. So it's something that we do see. Industry dependency may exist at some point in time, but this is something that, of course, needs to be tested. And this whole field is currently under development. So it is at an early stage that people are trying to figure out which combinations of certain indicators do work and how robust these results are. Because, of course, if we do find some kind of relationship, but then that is non-robust in a large set of cases, then that might also not be favorable. So that's something that is still under development, but it's definitely something that's interesting, and that's something that we all, as we do analytics, and as we do try and identify how to maneuver our business or what decisions to make, that we should kind of consider in the future if we try to identify which companies or which areas are about to grow in a certain space. So it's nice to look at the number of filings or the number of grants in a certain area, but we do want to figure out additional things.
Yeah, things are constantly moving and constantly shifting, and that's why I like the last one that you have here. Repeat, it's like rinse, repeat, reapply.
That is super important. We've seen this in the past. That again, it's just like going to the doctors, right? And if you're okay now, well, super, but you want to ensure that is also the case in a year or in half a year. So making this part of your routines, trying to identify different things, do an analysis a little differently. Also, excluding certain parts, looking beyond the top players in a certain place. Those are, or excluding a set of patents. Colin mentioned that, if we look into larger conglomerates, it does not make sense to, compare the entire portfolios because you'd be comparing apples and oranges, but actually figuring out a certain set. Going into a certain country, trying to identify, which patents come from a certain place or which are active in a certain place, and limiting yourself to those kind of things may provide additional insights. So, drilling in and out of the data and doing this over and over again as part of your routines is, I guess, the key to success there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So it seems like a lot of people are really liking this webinar. Mark also pointing out that there's all kinds of information that is given away in publications and companies provide that, so you got to be checking their publications. I mean, there's and all of this is possible today because of the technology.
Exactly.
I'm probably preaching to the choir here right now, but you got to be using some kind of technology solution in order to keep up with this. I mean, there's, and I don't even know the right number anymore. It's like quadrillion of bytes of data created like every hour or something like that in the internet age, and it's a ridiculous amount of data that's out there, and you have to be able to sort it somehow to make sense out of it. Otherwise, it's like a tsunami of information.
Plus also then enforce things, right? So it's just not, it's about, identifying that you have good data, good quality, that you know what you're doing, because this is all a garbage in, garbage out game. So, whatever you pour into the analytics will definitely determine your results. And then, as you have your analytics results, make sure that you think about what they tell you and also the limitations. That's super important. So,
right.
If we talk about patents, for example, as a data source, they are, as mentioned at the start, as my initial thought, they are as I understand, most comprehensive data source available. Definitely, if you compare to expert opinions and other sources. But of course, patents are limited to what those technologies and what is patent protected. So, understanding the limits, also understanding what indicators cannot tell you, understanding those boundaries is also something that's important. Plus, then last step, really important as well, if you have your idea of what to do, make sure to enforce it, or make sure to get it across to those people who actually can enforce it or have the decision power to actually take it a step further. Because if you have the coolest idea and then you don't put it into action, well, then this is all, of course, suboptimal there.
Yeah, no, agreed. All right, well, we're just about at the top of the hour, and I'd really like to give you an opportunity to wrap up. I know we didn't get to as many of your slides as we thought we were going to. I think we still gave everybody access to your slides, and this will create an opportunity for us to go and do a deeper dive at some point in the future using these slides, which kind of talked about the industry a little bit deeper from a bit of a different angle. We were going to look at the ongoing, we're going to talk a little bit about the ongoing litigation. So it was maybe a little bit tangential, but very interesting stuff going on in the air taxi market. But your final thoughts today, Carson, if people are going to leave today remembering something, what would you like them to be remembering?
Well, what I'd definitely like you to remember is, again, that, you know, doing these analytics and using data for decision making is something that is valuable, that is something that can be done, and that information exists, and that patents plus other sources, particularly in combination, do serve as a great opportunity. You know, is a great data source to make those decisions. And as you just mentioned, Jean, yeah, we didn't get across a couple of things. What is also super interesting though is, and that's maybe for you to understand, is I'm not an expert in the industry or in the air taxi industry, to be honest. So I'm just watching this, I'm just observing. So, you know, all the information that I identified that are part of the slide deck concerning the ongoing litigation are things that you can find online. So this is some, and then in the patent data. So this is nothing that has any inside information into the industry. And that again tells you that, you know, even if you are from a player or someone who's not from an industry that's of interest. So if you are from an automotive industry player, for example, then you can definitely obtain information on the air taxi space or on new players or new industries that are popping up. So that's something that is so cool about patent data, is that, you know, there is information, but then there's also ability to use it. And I'm happy to help, and I'd be happy to reach out. So if you do have anything that you'd like to ask or, you know, follow up on, or if you have any questions or thought, I'd be really happy to if you did reach out. So my mail is there. It'll be also on the slides, and you can find me on the LexisNexis website. So I'd be happy to discuss with you. And I also thank you, Jean, for the time.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Carson. It's been a pleasure getting this webinar together, working with you. It's been a pleasure hosting all of you guys in the audience. Thank you for coming. And, you know, my final thought is that I'm a fan of making decisions based on your gut and intuition, because I think too often we ignore that. But when you can make decisions that are backed up by data, and that data confirms what you feel, that data confirms what you have already kind of been leaning towards based on your experiences in the industry and your observations, then I think you've really got some decision-making power behind you. And then when the data is inconsistent with what your gut or intuition is telling you, it's those moments when I think you need to drill down a little bit deeper and see what's going on, you know, because there's going to be some interesting insights that you're going to learn about your observations, I think, because the data is not going to lie. The data is just there to be read, to be interpreted. So so I think it really is quite helpful, quite useful, and particularly with a tool that can help you put it into perspective and digest it in a meaningful way. So please feel free to reach out to Carson if you have any questions. And we really appreciate the support of LexisNexis IP. They've been a great partner for many years. So thank you for sponsoring this webinar. And that's all we have for today. And we hope to see you at a webinar here again in the future. But for now, have a good rest of your day, everybody.